The night Emily packed her suitcase, the apartment was painfully quiet. No shouting, no slammed doors, just the soft zip of fabric and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Lily was asleep in her crib, her tiny chest rising and falling, unaware that her world was about to shrink down to just one parent. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching his wife move around the bedroom like a stranger borrowing space. She didn't look angry. She looked tired, hollowed out, already halfway gone. "I can't do this anymore," Emily said, her voice low, careful. "I'm not built for this life, Ethan. The routines, the responsibility. I feel like I'm disappearing." Ethan didn't argue. He wanted to, but something in her tone told him it was pointless. You can't convince someone to stay when they have already left in their mind. "What about Lily?" he asked quietly. Emily paused, her hand resting on the suitcase handle. For a moment, Ethan thought she might cry. Instead, she shook her head. "She deserves someone who actually wants this," Emily said. "And that's you, not me." Those were the last real words they ever shared. The divorce papers came quickly. No custody battle, no long conversations. Emily signed away her parental rights without a fight, as if closing a chapter she didn't want to reread. Within weeks, she was gone. No forwarding address, no late-night calls, no birthdays marked on calendars. Just absence. Ethan learned how heavy silence could be. He learned how to warm bottles at 3 in the morning, how to rock a crying baby while his own chest ached with exhaustion. He learned how to smile at daycare drop-offs and collapse into the driver's seat afterward, gripping the steering wheel until the feeling passed. People told him he was strong. He didn't feel strong. He felt careful, fragile in a way no one could see. Lily grew quickly, too quickly. She learned to tie her shoes while Ethan answered work emails. She learned to wait quietly when he ran late. She learned, far too young, that her father was always tired, but always there. At night, after Lily fell asleep, Ethan would sit on the couch and stare at the empty space beside him. Sometimes he wondered where Emily was. Sometimes he wondered if he had failed her. But mostly he wondered one thing. How long could he keep holding everything together without breaking? And more importantly, what would happen if one day he did? Mornings became a careful routine. Ethan woke up before the sun, long before Lily stirred in her bed. He packed lunches, laid out tiny socks, double-checked backpacks like his life depended on it. In a way, it did. Lily never complained. She sat at the kitchen table swinging her legs while Ethan rushed through coffee that had gone cold. Sometimes she hummed to herself. Sometimes she watched him with eyes too observant for a 6-year-old. "You forgot to eat," she'd say gently. Ethan would smile and ruffle her hair. "I'll eat later, kiddo." Later rarely came. He dropped her off at school every morning, always a few minutes early, always lingering just long enough to watch her disappear into the building. Only then did he let his shoulders slump. Only then did the weight settle back in. Work filled the silence Emily had left behind. Ethan stayed late, volunteered for extra projects, answered emails long after midnight. The office was predictable. Numbers made sense. Deadlines didn't abandon you without explanation. At work, effort still guaranteed results, or at least the illusion of control. At home, life was softer, harder in a different way. Evenings were frozen dinners and bedtime stories read with half-lowered eyelids. Lily curled against him on the couch, her head resting on his arm like it belonged there. Some nights, Ethan fell asleep before she did. She never woke him. Instead, she pulled a blanket over both of them, the way she'd seen him do when she was sick. On weekends, they walked to the small park down the street. Lily climbed the jungle gym, while Ethan sat on a bench, answering emails he pretended couldn't wait. Every few minutes, she looked back to make sure he was watching. He always was. People at work praised his dedication. Neighbors called him that amazing single dad. But no one saw the quiet moments, the way Ethan stared at the ceiling at night, calculating bills, schedules, futures. He told himself this was temporary, that once things stabilized, once Lily was older, once work slowed down, things would get easier. What he didn't realize was that something else was slowly slipping away. Not all at once. Just little pieces of himself disappearing in the space between responsibility and love. Ethan Parker didn't fall into success by accident. He earned it the hard way, through long hours, careful decisions, and a reputation for never dropping the ball. At work, he was known as the guy who stayed late without being asked, the one who fixed problems before they became disasters, the one who didn't complain. When a system broke down on a Friday afternoon, Ethan stayed. When a shipment ran late, Ethan adjusted the schedule. When someone else missed a deadline, Ethan quietly absorbed the fallout. It was easier than going home early and feeling the silence. His calendar filled up weeks in advance. Meetings stacked on top of meetings. Lunches eaten standing up. Coffee replaced sleep. Sleep became optional. From the outside, it looked like ambition. From the inside, it felt like survival. That's when Claire Monroe started noticing him. She didn't comment at first. She simply watched how Ethan stayed focused when everyone else burned out, how he anticipated issues before they reached her desk. In meetings, he spoke calmly, clearly, never wasting words. He didn't demand attention. He earned it. One evening after a late operations review, Claire glanced at her watch. "You can stay if you want," she said, already gathering her things. "But you don't have to." Ethan hesitated, just for a second. "I should head out," he replied. "My daughter's waiting." Claire paused. That answer stayed with her longer than the meeting itself. Over the following weeks, she noticed patterns. Ethan declined after-hours dinners. He took calls in hallways, voice lowered. He never talked about his personal life, but somehow it was always present, just beneath the surface. Once, during a video call, Claire caught a glimpse of crayon drawings taped behind him. She didn't ask about them, but something shifted. Ethan thought if he kept pushing, just a little longer, things would eventually settle down. That the pressure was temporary, that he could outrun exhaustion if he stayed disciplined enough. What he didn't see was the cost quietly building, not just at work, but at home, and not just in his body, in the spaces where presence mattered more than effort. Claire Monroe had built her life on certainty, schedules, metrics, outcomes. Every decision backed by data, every risk calculated twice before it was taken. She trusted numbers because numbers didn't leave. They didn't change their minds halfway through the night. People often said she had everything: power, respect, money, influence. And on paper, they were right. Her days were full, her calendar booked weeks in advance. There was always another meeting, another deal, another problem to solve. What there wasn't was silence anyone shared with her. Claire noticed Ethan Parker because he reminded her of herself. Focused, reliable, controlled. He didn't seek attention or approval, he just worked. Steady, precise, almost relentless. But there was something else. He left when he said he would. Not often, but deliberately. When others lingered to impress, Ethan checked his watch. When conversations drifted into small talk, he excused himself without apology. "My daughter's waiting." The words echoed longer than they should have. Claire began to see the details she usually ignored. The way Ethan's tone softened on certain calls. How he declined last-minute dinners without explanation. How exhaustion clung to him, not loud or dramatic, but quiet and disciplined. Once, during a late video meeting, Claire noticed the background behind him. Childlike drawings taped neatly to the wall. A splash of color in an otherwise orderly space. She didn't comment. She told herself it was none of her business. Still, later that night, alone in her penthouse kitchen, Claire poured a glass of water and stood by the window longer than necessary. The city stretched out below her, glowing and restless. She thought about the people who worked for her. Hundreds of them. Thousands if she counted the factories. And then, unexpectedly, she thought about one man who left on time. Claire had always believed success required sacrifice. That something had to be given up to build something lasting. She just assumed everyone else had made peace with that trade. For the first time, she wondered, what if they hadn't? And what if she was the only one who had been wrong? The first call came after 10. Claire hadn't planned it that way. She was reviewing reports at her kitchen counter, city lights flickering beyond the glass, when she noticed Ethan was still online. His status icon glowed quietly on her screen. She hesitated, then dialed. "Sorry to bother you this late," she said when he answered. "I had a question about tomorrow's rollout." "No problem," Ethan replied. His voice was calm but softer than it was during meetings. "Give me a second." She heard movement, a door closing gently. When he came back, he spoke even more quietly. "My daughter's asleep," he explained. "I didn't want to wake her." The conversation stayed professional. At first, timelines, contingencies, numbers. But something about the hour loosened the edges. The urgency faded. The silence between words grew comfortable. "Do you ever stop working?" Ethan asked, almost amused. Claire paused. "I used to think stopping meant falling behind. And now, I'm not sure, she admitted. There was a small laugh on the other end, warm, unexpected. They talked longer than necessary about the project, about the pressure of leadership, about how exhaustion sneaks up on you when you convince yourself it's temporary. At one point, Claire heard a faint sound. Footsteps. A sleepy sigh. Lily, Ethan murmured. Claire waited. She just needed water, he said when he came back. She always forgets before bed. Something in Claire's chest shifted. After that night, the calls became occasional, then regular, sometimes about work, sometimes not. Ethan talked about mornings packed with lunches and missing socks. Claire talked about growing up fast, about learning early that independence was safer than reliance. Neither of them named what was happening. They didn't have to. Those conversations became a pause in the day. An hour where neither of them had to perform, where titles didn't matter, where the world felt smaller, quieter, more honest. Ethan didn't realize it yet, but those late-night calls were the only moments he wasn't holding his breath. And Claire didn't realize they were becoming the part of her day she looked forward to most. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, through longer meetings, tighter deadlines, and an email marked urgent that never seemed to be the last one. When the company announced a major operational expansion, Ethan was the obvious choice to lead it. Everyone congratulated him. No one asked if he could handle it. His days stretched into nights. His nights blurred into mornings. Coffee replaced meals. Sleep became something he planned for but rarely reached. The late-night calls with Claire grew shorter, not because she stopped calling, but because Ethan was too exhausted to be present. I'm sorry, he told her one night. Can we talk tomorrow? Tomorrow kept getting pushed back. At home, Lily noticed before anyone else did. He forgot her favorite cereal, mixed up school spirit days, missed a bedtime story and promised two the next night. She never complained. She just nodded and adjusted, the way children do when they sense adults are barely holding things together. One Thursday afternoon, everything finally cracked. A supplier issue turned into a full-scale disruption. Phones rang nonstop, meetings stacked back to back. Ethan glanced at the time once, then again, then stopped checking altogether. By the time he looked up, the office was quieter. Too quiet. His phone buzzed. School office. His stomach dropped. Ethan was on the road before the call ended, heart pounding, hands tight on the steering wheel. Lily was sitting on a bench near the front desk when he arrived, her backpack at her feet, legs swinging slowly. She didn't cry. She looked relieved. I waited, she said softly. I knew you'd come. Ethan knelt in front of her, shame burning in his chest. I'm so sorry, he whispered. Lily studied his face for a moment, then asked the question he wasn't ready for. Are you working so much so you don't leave like Mom did? Ethan froze. That night after Lily fell asleep, he sat alone in the dark, the weight finally undeniable. This wasn't sustainable, and if he didn't choose differently, he was going to lose the one thing he was working so hard to protect. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He lay on the couch with the lights off, staring at the ceiling while Lily breathed softly in the next room. Every few minutes, he replayed her voice in his head. Not loud, not accusing, just honest. Are you working so much so you don't leave like Mom did? The question cut deeper than any failure at work ever had. He thought about the day Emily left, how she said responsibility felt like a cage, how she walked away believing distance would fix what she couldn't face. Ethan had sworn he would never be that kind of parent. And yet here he was, present in name, absent in moments. He sat up and rubbed his face, exhaustion pressing behind his eyes. On the coffee table lay unpaid bills, a school flyer he hadn't read, a calendar packed so tightly there wasn't a single empty square. He had built a life that looked responsible from the outside. Inside, it felt like a slow collapse. In the early hours of the morning, Ethan walked into Lily's room. Moonlight spilled across the floor, catching the edges of her drawings taped to the wall. Stick figures, holding hands, smiling too wide. He sat on the edge of her bed and watched her sleep. I'm here, he whispered, though she couldn't hear him. I'm not going anywhere. But promises meant nothing without change. By sunrise, his decision had taken shape. Not fully formed, but undeniable. He couldn't keep asking Lily to wait. He couldn't keep telling himself this pace was temporary. Temporary had a way of becoming permanent when fear was involved. At work that day, Ethan moved through meetings on autopilot. Claire noticed immediately. You okay? She asked quietly as they walked out of a conference room. Ethan nodded out of habit, then stopped. No, he said, I'm not. It was the first honest answer he'd given in a long time. That night, after Lily fell asleep with her hand curled around his sleeve, Ethan opened his laptop. The screen glowed in the dark, and for the first time, he didn't ask what his career needed. He asked what his daughter did, and what he needed to do to stay. Ethan finished the letter just before dawn. He read it 3 times, each sentence measured, professional calm. There were no accusations, no dramatics, just the truth, written plainly. He thanked the company for the opportunity. He acknowledged the trust placed in him, and then he asked to step away. When the sun rose, the decision felt heavier, but no longer uncertain. He dropped Lily off at school, hugged her a second longer than usual, then drove straight to the office. By mid-morning, he was standing outside Claire Monroe's office, envelope in hand, heart steady in a way that surprised him. "Come in," she said. Claire looked up from her desk, sharp and composed as always. Ethan didn't sit. He placed the envelope down between them. "I'm resigning," he said. The silence that followed was dense, deliberate. Claire picked up the letter but didn't open it. "Is this about the expansion?" she asked. "We can shift resources, adjust timelines." "It's not the workload," Ethan replied. "It's what it's costing." She studied him now, really studied him. The exhaustion, the resolve, the quiet finality in his posture. "You're one of the best people we have," Claire said. "I don't say that lightly. We can make this work." Ethan shook his head. "I've been making it work. That's the problem." He took a breath. "My daughter asked me if I was working so much because I was afraid of leaving her, like her mother did." Claire's expression changed. "Not dramatically, just enough." "I can't answer that question and keep this job," Ethan continued. "I won't ask her to keep waiting while I figure it out." Claire leaned back, hands folded, control warring with something softer beneath the surface. "I respect your decision," she said quietly, "even if I don't want to." He nodded. "That means more than you know." As he turned to leave, Claire spoke again. "Ethan," he looked back, "I hope you find what you're looking for." He didn't say it out loud, but he knew. For the first time in years, he already had. And walking out of that office, envelope empty, Ethan felt something unfamiliar and frightening. Relief. The office didn't slow down after Ethan resigned. If anything, it moved faster. Meetings filled the gaps he left behind. Emails piled up. Decisions were made, revised, made again. Claire handled it all with the same efficiency she always had. Sharp, decisive, unflinching. From the outside, nothing looked different. Inside, everything did. For the first time in years, Claire found herself glancing at the clock without a reason. 10 past 10, 10:30, 11. Her phone stayed silent. No late-night call. No calm voice asking a thoughtful question. No quiet laugh at the end of a long day. She told herself it was for the best. Ethan had chosen his daughter. She respected that. She admired it even. That should have been the end of it. But the silence pressed in anyway. At night, Claire stood at her kitchen window. The city spread out below her like a map she'd already mastered. She had built all of this. Every floor, every contract, every system designed to keep things running smoothly. And yet she felt strangely unmoored. She caught herself rereading old meeting notes, pausing at Ethan's comments. Clear, practical, human. She remembered the way he lowered his voice on calls, the patience in his answers, the steadiness he brought into every room. 3 days passed. On the third evening, Claire sat alone at her dining table, a plate of food untouched in front of her. She realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten without multitasking, or the last time she'd felt this uncertain. She thought about Lily, about the question Ethan had shared, the quiet resolve in his eyes when he'd said he couldn't keep asking his daughter to wait. Something in Claire cracked open. She hadn't lost an employee. She had lost a connection. And worse, she had let it go without ever saying what it meant. Claire stood up suddenly, heart racing, a decision forming faster than she could analyze it. For once, she didn't calculate the risk. She grabbed her coat, her keys, and stepped out into the night, toward a choice she could no longer ignore, toward a door she hoped wasn't already closed. The rain started harder than Claire expected. By the time she parked across the street from Ethan's building, her coat was already damp, her hair pulled loose by the wind. She sat in the car for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, heart pounding like she was about to step into something she couldn't undo. She had never done this before. No assistance, no scheduling, no preparation. Just a choice. When Ethan opened the door, he froze. Claire stood there, rain dripping from her sleeves, eyes unshielded in a way he had never seen. Behind him, the apartment glowed warm and lived in. A small pair of sneakers by the door, crayon drawings taped to the fridge. For a second, neither of them spoke. I accepted your resignation, Claire said finally, her voice steady despite the rain. But I didn't accept losing you. Ethan swallowed. Claire, I'm not here as your CEO, she continued. I'm here because I watched you choose your daughter when it cost you everything. And I realized something. She stepped closer, water pooling at her feet. I don't want to build a life where people like you have to leave to be whole. Silence stretched between them, heavy and honest. I won't ask you to come back the way things were, Claire said. I won't ask you to choose between work and Lily. I just needed you to know. You mattered. You still do. Ethan felt something inside him finally loosen. You showed up, he said quietly, in the rain. Claire gave a small, uncertain smile. I was afraid you wouldn't open the door. He stepped aside. Come in, Ethan said. You're soaked. As the door closed behind them, the rain kept falling outside. But inside, something shifted. Not fixed. Not solved. Just open. And for the first time since he walked away, Ethan felt the weight on his chest ease. Because this time, no one was asking him to leave what mattered most. They didn't rush into anything. Claire sat at Ethan's small kitchen table, a towel draped over her shoulders, steam rising from two mismatched mugs of coffee. The apartment was quiet, Lily asleep in the next room, the hum of rain still tapping at the windows. I don't want to complicate your life, Claire said carefully. You've already done the hardest thing, choosing your daughter. Ethan nodded. That's exactly why I'm scared, he admitted. I can't afford to get this wrong. Claire didn't flinch. Neither can I. She slid a folder across the table. Not a contract, not a demand. Just an idea. Flexible hours, remote work, a role focused on employee well-being. Something built around real life, not the other way around. This isn't a way to get you back, she said. It's a way to make sure no one else has to walk away to stay whole. Ethan read quietly. The words felt different. Humane. Thoughtful. Possible. I won't decide tonight, he said. I wouldn't want you to, Claire replied. This has to be your choice, completely. They talked until the coffee went cold. About Lily, about boundaries, about taking things slowly. About how fear doesn't disappear just because something feels right. When Claire stood to leave, Ethan walked her to the door. Thank you, he said, for coming, for saying it out loud. She smiled, soft and unguarded. Thank you for opening the door. After she left, Ethan stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then he went into Lily's room, watched her sleep, and finally felt the knot in his chest loosen. This wasn't about going back. It was about moving forward, carefully, honestly, with room for everything that mattered. Life didn't transform overnight. There were no grand speeches, no sudden miracles, just small, steady changes that added up to something real. Ethan accepted the new role a few weeks later, on his terms. He worked from home most days, structured his hours around school drop-offs and bedtime stories. The pace was different, slower, intentional. For the first time in years, he ate dinner at the table instead of over a laptop. Lily noticed immediately. You're not tired all the time anymore, she said one evening, swinging her legs beneath the chair. Ethan smiled. I still get tired, just not lost. Claire took things slowly too. She didn't step into Ethan's life as a replacement for anyone. She showed up as herself, patient, present, respectful of the space Ethan and Lily had built together. Sometimes that meant sitting on the floor coloring. Sometimes it meant stepping back. One night, Lily looked up from her drawing and asked, Are you staying? Claire glanced at Ethan before answering. Yes, she said softly. If that's okay with you. Lily considered this carefully, then nodded. Okay. That was how it began. Not perfectly, not dramatically. But honestly, months passed. The company changed too. New policies, healthier expectations, fewer late-night emails. Claire learned that leadership didn't weaken when it made room for people. It strengthened. Ethan learned something just as important. Choosing his daughter hadn't cost him everything. It had given him his life back. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, the three of them sat on the balcony, Lily between them, Claire's shoulder resting lightly against Ethan's. The air was quiet, comfortable. Ethan thought about how close he'd come to losing this, how easy it is to confuse survival with success, and how brave it can be to stay when leaving feels simpler. So here's the question for you. If you were Ethan, what would you have chosen? Would you have walked away from a career you worked so hard to build to protect what mattered most? And if you were Claire, would you have had the courage to knock on that door? Sometimes the most meaningful decisions aren't the ones that move us forward fastest, but the ones that bring us home. If this story moved you, made you pause, or reminded you of something or someone important in your own life, we'd love to have you here. Subscribe to the channel for more human stories about love, family, sacrifice, and the quiet courage it takes to choose what truly matters. Because the stories worth telling are often the ones we're still learning how to live.